Recording by Matt Braymiller. Number 5 Branchline, The Engineer, by Amelia B. Edwards. His name, sir, was Matthew Price. Mine is Benjamin Hardy. We were born within a few days of each other, bred up in the same village, taught at the same school. I cannot remember the time when we were not close friends. Even as boys we never knew what it was to quarrel. We had not a thought, we had not a possession, that was not in common. We would have stood by each other fearlessly to the death. It was such a friendship as one reads about sometimes in books, fast and firm as the great tors upon our native moorlands, true as the sun in the heavens. The name of our village was Chadleigh. Lifted high above the pasture flats which stretched away at our feet like a measureless green lake and melted into mist on the furthest horizon, it nestled, a tiny stone-built hamlet, in a sheltered hollow about midway between the plain and the plateau. Above us, rising ridge beyond ridge, slope beyond slope, spread the mountainous moor country, bare and bleak for the most part, with here and there a patch of cultivated field or hardy plantation, and crowned highest of all with masses of huge grey crag, abrupt, isolated, hoary, and older than the deluge. These were the tors, Druid's Tor, King's Tor, Castle Tor, and the like, sacred places, as I have heard, in the ancient time, where crownings, burnings, human sacrifices, and all kinds of bloody heathen rites were performed. Bones, too, have been found there, and arrowheads, and ornaments of gold and glass. I had a vague awe of the tors in those boyish days, and would not have gone near them after dark for the heaviest bribe. I have said that we were born in the same village. He was the son of a small farmer named William Price, and the eldest of a family of 7. I was the only child of Ephraim Hardy, the Chadleigh blacksmith, a well-known man in those parts whose memory is not forgotten to this day. Just so far as a farmer is supposed to be a bigger man than a blacksmith, Matt's father might be said to have a better standing than mine. But William Price, with his small holding and his 7 boys, was, in fact, as poor as many a day-labourer, whilst the blacksmith, well-to-do, bustling, popular, and open-handed, was a person of some importance in the place. All this, however, had nothing to do with Matt and myself. It never occurred to either of us that his jacket was out at the elbows, or that our mutual funds came altogether from my pocket. It was enough for us that we sat on the same school bench, conned our tasks from the same primer, fought each other's battles, screened each other's faults, fished, nutted, played truant, robbed orchards and birds' nests together, and spent every half-hour, authorized or stolen, in each other's society. It was a happy time, but it could not go on forever. My father, being prosperous, resolved to put me forward in the world. I must know more and do better than himself. The forge was not good enough, the little world of Chadleigh not wide enough for me. Thus it happened that I was still swinging the satchel when Matt was whistling at the plough, and that at last, when my future course was shaped out, we were separated, as it then seemed to us, for life. For blacksmith's son as I was, furnace and forge in some form or other pleased me best, and I chose to be a working engineer. So my father by and by apprenticed me to a Birmingham ironmaster, and having bidden farewell to Matt and Chadleigh and the grey old tors in the shadow of which I had spent all the days of my life, I turned my face northward and went over into the Black Country. I am not going to dwell on this part of my story, how I worked out the term of my apprenticeship, how when I had served my full time and become a skilled workman, I took Matt from the plough and brought him over to the Black Country, sharing with him lodging, wages, experience, all, in short, that I had to give. How he, naturally quick to learn and brimful of quiet energy, worked his way up a step at a time and came, by and by, to be a first hand in his own department. How, during all these years of change and trial and effort, the old boyish affection never wavered or weakened, but went on, growing with our growth and strengthening with our strength, are facts which I need do no more than outline in this place. About this time, it will be remembered that I speak of the days when Matt and I were on the bright side of 30. It happened that our firm contracted to supply 6 first-class locomotives to run on the new line, then in process of construction between Turin and Genoa. It was the first Italian order we had taken. We had had dealings with France, Holland, Belgium, Germany, but never with Italy. The connection, therefore, was new and valuable. All the more valuable because our Transalpine neighbors had but lately begun to lay down the iron roads, and would be safe to need more of our good English work as they went on. So the Birmingham firm set themselves to the contract with a will, lengthened our working hours, increased our wages, took on fresh hands, and determined, if energy and promptitude could do it, to place themselves at the head of the Italian labour market and stay there. They deserved and achieved success. The 6 locomotives were not only turned out to time, but were shipped, dispatched, and delivered with a promptitude that fairly amazed our Piedmontese consignee. I was not a little proud, you may be sure, when I found myself appointed to superintend the transport of the engines. Being allowed a couple of assistants, I contrived that Mat should be one of them, and thus we enjoyed together the first great holiday of our lives. It was a wonderful change for 2 Birmingham operatives, fresh from the Black Country. The fairy city, with its crescent background of Alps, the port crowded with strange shipping, the marvellous blue sky and the bluer sea, the painted houses on the quays, the quaint cathedral faced with black and white marble, the street of jewellers like an Arabian Nights' bazaar, the street of palaces with its Moorish courtyards, its fountains and orange trees, the women veiled like brides, the galley slaves chained 2 and 2, the processions of priests and friars, the everlasting clangor of bells, the babble of a strange tongue, the singular lightness and brightness of the climate, made, altogether, such a combination of wonders that we wandered about, the first day, in a kind of bewildered dream, like children at a fair. Before that week was ended, being tempted by the beauty of the place and the liberality of the pay, we had agreed to take service with the Turin and Genoa Railway Company, and to turn our backs upon Birmingham for ever. Then began a new life, a life so active and healthy, so steeped in fresh air and sunshine that we sometimes marvelled how we could have endured the gloom of the Black Country. We were constantly up and down the line, now at Genoa, now at Turin, taking trial trips with the locomotives and placing our old experiences at the services of our new employers. In the meanwhile we made Genoa our headquarters, and hired a couple of rooms over a small shop in a by-street sloping down to the quays. Such a busy little street, so steep and winding that no vehicles could pass through it, and so narrow that the sky looked like a mere strip of deep blue ribbon overhead. Every house in it, however, was a shop, where the goods encroached on the footway, or were piled about the door, or hung like tapestry from the balconies, and all day long, from dawn to dusk, an incessant stream of passers-by poured up and down between the port and the upper quarter of the city. Our landlady was the widow of a silver worker, and lived by the sale of filigree ornaments, cheap jewelry, combs, fans, and toys in ivory and jet. She had an only daughter named Gianetta, who served in the shop, and was simply the most beautiful woman I ever beheld. Looking back across this weary chasm of years, and bringing her image before me, as I can and do, with all the vividness of life, I am unable even now to detect a flaw in her beauty. I do not attempt to describe her. I do not believe there is a poet living who could find the words to do it, but I once saw a picture that was somewhat like her, not half so lovely, but still like her, and, for aught I know, that picture is still hanging where I last looked at it, upon the walls of the Louvre. It represented a woman with brown eyes and golden hair, looking over her shoulder into a circular mirror held by a bearded man in the background. In this man, as I then understood, the artist had painted his own portrait, in her the portrait of the woman he loved. No picture that I ever saw was half so beautiful, and yet it was not worthy to be named in the same breath with Gianetta Coniglia. You may be certain the widow's shop did not want for customers. All Genoa knew how fair a face was to be seen behind that dingy little counter, and Gianetta, flirt as she was, had more lovers than she cared to remember even by name. Gentle and simple, rich and poor, from the red-capped sailor buying his earrings or his amulet, to the nobleman carelessly purchasing half the filigrees in the window, she treated them all alike, encouraged them, laughed at them, led them on, and turned them off at her pleasure. She had no more heart than a marble statue, as Mat and I discovered by and by, to our bitter cost. I cannot tell to this day how it came about, or what first led me to suspect how things were going with us both. But long before the waning of that autumn, a coldness had sprung up between my friend and myself. It was nothing that could have been put into words. It was nothing that either of us could have explained or justified to save his life. We lodged together, ate together, worked together, exactly as before. We even took our long evening's walk together, when the day's labor was ended, and except, perhaps, that we were more silent than of old, no mere looker-on could have detected a shadow of change. Yet there it was, silent and subtle, widening the gulf between us every day. It was not his fault. He was too true and gentle-hearted to have willingly brought about such a state of things between us. Neither do I believe, fiery as my nature is, that it was mine. It was all hers, hers from first to last, the sin and the shame and the sorrow. If she had shown a fair and open preference for either of us, no real harm could have come of it. I would have put any constraint upon myself, and heaven knows, have borne any suffering to see Mat really happy. I know that he would have done the same, and more if he could, for me. But Gianetta cared not one sou for either. She never meant to choose between us. It gratified her vanity to divide us. It amused her to play with us. It would pass my power to tell how, by 1,000 imperceptible shades of coquetry, by the lingering of a glance, the substitution of a word, the flitting of a smile, she contrived to turn our heads and torture our hearts and lead us on to love her. She deceived us both. She buoyed us up with hope. She maddened us with jealousy. She crushed us with despair. For my part, when I seemed to wake to a sudden sense of the ruin that was about our path, and I saw how the truest friendship that ever bound two lives together was drifting on to wreck and ruin, I asked myself whether any woman in the world was worth what Mat had been to me and I to him. But this was not often. I was readier to shut my eyes upon the truth than to face it, and so lived on, wilfully, in a dream. Thus the autumn passed away, and winter came, the strange, treacherous Genoese winter, green with olive and ilex, brilliant with sunshine and bitter with storm. Still, rivals at heart and friends on the surface, Mat and I lingered on in our lodging at the Vicolo Balba. Still Gianetta held us with her fatal wiles, and her still more fatal beauty. At length there came a day when I felt I could bear the horrible misery and suspense of it no longer. The sun, I vowed, should not go down before I knew my sentence. She must choose between us. She must either take me or let me go. I was reckless. I was desperate. I was determined to know the worst or the best. If the worst, I would at once turn my back upon Genoa, upon her, upon all the pursuits and purposes of my past life, and begin the world anew. This I told her passionately and sternly, standing before her in the little parlour at the back of the shop one bleak December morning. "If it's Mat you care for most," I said, "tell me so in one word, and I will never trouble you again. He is better worth your love. I am jealous and exacting. He is as trusting and unselfish as a woman. Speak, Gianetta. Am I to bid you good-bye for ever and ever, or am I to write home to my mother in England, bidding her pray to God to bless the woman who has promised to be my wife?" "You plead your friend's cause well," she replied haughtily. "Matteo ought to be grateful. This is more than he ever did for you." "Give me an answer, for pity's sake," I exclaimed, "and let me go." "You are free to go or stay, Signor Inglese," she replied. "I am not your jailer." "Do you bid me leave you?" "Beata Madre, not I." "Will you marry me if I stay?" She laughed aloud, such a merry, mocking, musical laugh, like a chime of silver bells. "You ask too much," she said. "Only what you have led me to hope these 5 or 6 months past." "That is just what Matteo says. How tiresome you both are!" "Oh, Gianetta," I said passionately, "be serious for one moment. I am a rough fellow, it is true, not half good enough or clever enough for you, but I love you with my whole heart, and an emperor could do no more." "I am glad of it," she replied. "I do not want you to love me less." "Then you cannot wish to make me wretched. Will you promise me?" "I promise nothing," she said, with another burst of laughter, "except that I will not marry Matteo." Except that she would not marry Matteo. Only that. Not a word of hope for myself, nothing but my friend's condemnation. I might get comfort and selfish triumph and some sort of base assurance out of that, if I could. And so, to my shame, I did. I grasped at the vain encouragement, and, fool that I was, let her put me off again unanswered. From that day I gave up all effort at self-control, and let myself drift blindly on to destruction. At length things became so bad between Mat and myself that it seemed as if an open rupture must be at hand. We avoided each other, scarcely exchanged a dozen sentences in a day, and fell away from all our old familiar habits. At this time, I shudder to remember it, there were moments when I felt that I hated him. Thus, with the trouble deepening and widening between us day by day, another month or 5 weeks went by, and February came. And, with February, the carnival. They said in Genoa that it was a particularly dull carnival, and so it must have been, for save a flag or two hung out in some of the principal streets, and a sort of festa look about the women, there were no special indications of the season. It was, I think, the second day when, having been on the line all morning, I returned to Genoa at dusk, and to my surprise found Mat Price on the platform. He came up to me and laid his hand on my arm. "You are in late," he said. "I have been waiting for you 3/4 of an hour. Shall we dine together to-day?" Impulsive as I am, this evidence of returning goodwill at once called up my better feelings. "With all my heart, Mat," I replied. "Shall we go to Ghoulies?" "No, no," he said hurriedly. "Some quieter place. Some place where we can talk. I have something to say to you." I noticed now that he looked pale and agitated, and an uneasy sense of apprehension stole upon me. We decided on the Pescatore, a little out-of-the-way trattoria, down near Molo Vecchio. There, in a dingy salon, frequented chiefly by seamen, and redolent of tobacco, we ordered our simple dinner. Mat scarcely swallowed a morsel, but, calling presently for a bottle of Sicilian wine, drank eagerly. "Well, Mat," I said, as the last dish was placed on the table, "what news have you?" "Bad." "I guessed that from your face." "Bad for you. Bad for me. Gianetta." "What of Gianetta?" He passed his hand nervously across his lips. "Gianetta is false. Worse than false," he said in a hoarse voice. "She values an honest man's heart just as she values a flower for her hair. Wears it for a day, then throws it aside forever. She has cruelly wronged us both." "In what way? Good heavens, speak out." "In the worst way that a woman can wrong those who love her. She has sold herself to the Marchese Loredano." The blood rushed to my head and face in a burning torrent. I could scarcely see, and I dared not trust myself to speak. "I saw her going towards the cathedral," he went on hurriedly. "It was about 3 hours ago. I thought she might be going to confession, so I hung back and followed her at a distance. When she got inside, however, she went straight to the back of the pulpit, where this man was waiting for her. You remember him, an old man who used to haunt the shop a month or two back? Well, seeing how deep in conversation they were, and how they stood close under the pulpit with their backs toward the church, I fell into a passion of anger and went straight up the aisle, intending to say or do something, I scarcely knew what, but, at all events, to draw her arm through mine and take her home. When I came within a few feet, however, and found only a big pillar between myself and them, I paused. They could not see me, nor I them, but I could hear their voices distinctly, and I listened." "Well, and you heard?" "The terms of a shameful bargain. Beauty on the one side, gold on the other, so many 1,000 francs a year, a villa near Naples. Pah! It makes me sick to repeat it." And, with a shudder, he poured out another glass of wine and drank it at a draught. After that, he said presently, I made no effort to bring her away. The whole thing was so cold-blooded, so deliberate, so shameful, that I felt I had only to wipe her out of my memory and leave her to her fate. I stole out of the cathedral and walked about here by the sea for ever so long, trying to get my thoughts straight. Then I remembered you, Ben, and the recollection of how this wanton had come between us and broken up our lives drove me wild. So I went up to the station and waited for you. I felt you ought to know it all, and I thought, perhaps, that we might go back to England together." "The Marchese Loredano?" It was all that I could say, all that I could think. As Matt had just said of himself, I felt like one stunned. "There is one other thing I may as well tell you," he added reluctantly, "if only to show you how false a woman can be. We were to have been married next month." "We? Who? What do you mean?" "I mean that we were to have been married, Gianetta and I." A sudden storm of rage, of scorn, of incredulity swept over me at this, and seemed to carry my senses away. "You?" I cried. "Gianetta marry you? I don't believe it." "I wish I had not believed it," he replied, looking up as if puzzled by my vehemence. "But she promised me, and I thought when she promised it, she meant it." "She told me weeks ago that she would never be your wife." His color rose, his brow darkened, but when his answer came, it was as calm as the last. "Indeed," he said, "then it is only one baseness more. She told me that she had refused you, and that was why we kept our engagement secret." "Tell the truth, Mat Price," I said, well nigh beside myself with suspicion. "Confess that every word of this is false. Confess that Gianetta will not listen to you, and that you are afraid I may succeed where you have failed, as perhaps I shall after all." "Are you mad?" he exclaimed. "What do you mean?" "That I believe it's just a trick to get me away to England. That I don't credit a syllable of your story. You're a liar, and I hate you." He rose, and, laying one hand to the back of his chair, looked me sternly in the face. "If you were not Benjamin Hardy," he said deliberately, "I would thrash you within an inch of your life." The words had no sooner passed his lips than I sprang at him. I have never been able distinctly to remember what followed. A curse, a blow, a struggle, a moment of blind fury, a cry, a confusion of tongues, a circle of strange faces. Then I see Mat lying back in the arms of a bystander, myself trembling and bewildered, the knife dropping from my grasp, blood upon the floor, blood upon my hands, blood upon his shirt. And then I hear those dreadful words, "Oh, Ben, you have murdered me." He did not die, at least not there and then. He was carried to the nearest hospital and lay for some weeks between life and death. His case, they said, was difficult and dangerous. The knife had gone in just below the collarbone and pierced down into the lungs. He was not allowed to speak or turn, scarcely to breathe with freedom. He might not even lift his head to drink. I sat by him day and night all through that sorrowful time. I gave up my situation on the railway. I quitted my lodging in the Vicola Balba. I tried to forget that such a woman as Gianetta Coneglia had ever drawn breath. I lived only for Mat, and he tried to live more, I believe, for my sake than his own. Thus, in the bitter silent hours of pain and penitence, when no hand but mine approached his lips or smoothed his pillow, the old friendship came back, and even more than its old trust and faithfulness. He forgave me, fully and freely, and I would thankfully have given my life for him. At length there came one bright spring morning, when, dismissed as convalescent, he tottered out through the hospital gates leaning on my arm, and feeble as an infant. He was not cured. Neither, as I then learned to my horror and anguish, was it possible that he ever could be cured. He might live, with care, for some years, but the lungs were injured beyond hope of remedy, and a strong or healthy man he could never be again. These, spoken aside to me, were the parting words of the chief physician, who advised me to take him further south without delay. I took him to a little coast town called Rocca, some 30 miles beyond Genoa, a sheltered, lonely place along the Riviera, where the sea was even bluer than the sky, and the cliffs were green with strange tropical plants, cacti and aloes and Egyptian palms. Here we lodged in the house of a small tradesman, and Mat, to use his own words, set to work at getting well in good earnest. But alas! it was a work which no earnestness could forward. Day after day he went down to the beach, and sat for hours drinking the sea air, and watching the sails that came and went in the offing. By and by he could go no further than the garden of the house in which we lived. A little later, and he spent his days on a couch beside the open window, waiting patiently for the end. Aye, for the end. It had come to that. He was fading fast, waning with the waning summer, and conscious that the reaper was at hand. His whole aim now was to soften the agony of my remorse, and prepare me for what must shortly come. "I would not live longer if I could," he said, lying on his couch one summer evening and looking up to the stars. "If I had my choice at this moment, I would ask to go. I should like Gianetta to know that I forgave her." "She shall know it," I said, trembling suddenly from head to foot. He pressed my hand. "And you'll write to father?" "I will." I had drawn back a little, that he might not see the tears raining down my cheeks, but he raised himself on his elbow and looked round. "Don't fret, Ben," he whispered, laid his head back wearily upon the pillow, and so died. And this was the end of it. This was the end of all that made life life to me. I buried him there, in hearing of the wash of a strange sea on a strange shore. I stayed by the grave till the priest and the bystanders were gone. I saw the earth filled in to the last sod, and the grave-digger stamped it down with his feet. Then, and not till then, I felt that I had lost him forever, the friend I had loved, and hated, and slain. Then, and not till then, I knew that all rest and joy and hope were over for me. From that moment my heart hardened within me, and my life was filled with loathing. Day and night, land and sea, labor and rest, food and sleep were alike hateful to me. It was the curse of Cain, and that my brother had pardoned me made it lie none the lighter. Peace on earth was for me no more, and goodwill towards men was dead in my heart forever. Remorse softened some natures, but it poisoned mine. I hated all mankind, but above all mankind I hated the woman who had come between us two, and ruined both our lives. He had bidden me seek her out, and be the messenger of his forgiveness. I had sooner have gone down to the port of Genoa and taken upon me the serge cap and shotted chain of any galley slave at his toil in the public works, but for all that I did my best to obey him. I went back, alone and on foot. I went back intending to say to her, "Gianetta Coniglia, he forgave you, but God never will." But she was gone. The little shop was let to a fresh occupant, and the neighbors only knew that mother and daughter had left the place quite suddenly, and that Gianetta was supposed to be under the protection of the Marchese Loredano. How I made inquiries here and there, how I heard that they had gone to Naples, and how, being restless and reckless of my time, I worked my passage in a French steamer and followed her. How, having found the sumptuous villa that was now hers, I learned that she had left there some 10 days and gone to Paris, where the Marchese was ambassador for the two Sicilies. How, working my passage back again to Marseilles, and thence in part by the river and in part by the rail, I made my way to Paris. How, day after day, I paced the streets and the parks, watched at the ambassador's gates, followed his carriage, and at last, after weeks of waiting, discovered her address. How, having written to request an interview, her servant spurned me from her door and flung my letter in my face. How, looking up at her windows, I then, instead of forgiving, solemnly cursed her with the bitterest curses my tongue could devise. And how, this done, I shook the dust of Paris from my feet and became a wanderer upon the face of the earth, are facts which I have now no space to tell. The next 6 or 8 years of my life were shifting and unsettled enough. A morose and restless man, I took employment here and there as opportunity offered, turning my hand to many things and caring little what I earned, so long as the work was hard and the change incessant. First of all, I engaged myself as chief engineer in one of the French steamers plying between Marseilles and Constantinople. At Constantinople I changed to one of the Austrian Lloyd's boats, and worked for some time to and fro from Alexandria, Jaffa, and those parts. After that I fell in with a party of Mr. Layard's men at Cairo, and so went up the Nile, and took a turn at the excavations of the mound of Nimrod. Then I became a working engineer on the new desert line between Alexandria and Suez, and by I worked my passage out to Bombay and took service as an engine fitter on one of the great Indian railways. I stayed a long time in India. That is to say, I stayed nearly 2 years, which was a long time for me, and I might not even have left so soon but for the war that was declared just then with Russia. That tempted me, for I loved danger and hardship as other men love safety and ease, and as for my life, I had sooner have parted from it than kept it any day. So I came straight back to England, betook myself to Portsmouth, where my testimonials at once procured me the sort of berth I wanted. I went out to the Crimea in the engine-room of one of Her Majesty's war steamers. I served with the fleet, of course, while the war lasted, and when it was over went wandering off again, rejoicing in my liberty. This time I went to Canada, and after working on a railway then in progress near the American frontier, I presently passed over into the States, journeyed from north to south, crossed the Rocky Mountains, tried a month or two of life in the gold country, and then, being seized with a sudden, aching, unaccountable longing to revisit that solitary grave so far away on the Italian coast, I turned my face once more towards Europe. Poor little grave! I found it rank with weeds, the cross half shattered, the inscription half effaced. It was as if no one had loved him or remembered him. I went back to the house in which we had lodged together. The same people were still living there, and made me kindly welcome. I stayed with them for some weeks. I weeded and planted, and trimmed the grave with my own hands, and set up a fresh cross in pure white marble. It was the first season of rest that I had known since I laid him there, and when at last I shouldered my knapsack and set forth again to battle with the world, I promised myself that, God willing, I would creep back to Rocca when my days drew near to ending, and be buried by his side. From hence, being perhaps a little less inclined than formerly for very distant parts, and willing to keep within reach of that grave, I went no further than Mantua, where I engaged myself as an engine driver on the line, then not long completed, between that city and Venice. Somehow, although I had been trained to the working engineering, I preferred in these days to earn my bread by driving. I liked the excitement of it, the sense of power, the rush of the air, the roar of the fire, the flitting of the landscape. Above all, I enjoyed to drive a night express. The worse the weather, the better it suited my sullen temper, for I was as hard and harder than ever. The years had done nothing to soften me. They had only confirmed that all was blackest and bitterest in my heart. I continued pretty faithful to the Mantua line, and had been working on it steadily for more than 7 months, when that which I am now about to relate took place. It was the month of March. The weather had been unsettled for some days past, and the nights stormy, and at one point along the line near Ponte di Brenta the waters had risen and swept away some 70 yards of embankment. Since this accident the trains had all been obliged to stop at a certain spot between Padua and Ponte di Brenta, and the passengers with their luggage had thence to be transported in all kinds of vehicles by a circuitous country road to the nearest station on the other side of the gap, where another train and engine awaited them. This, of course, caused great confusion and annoyance, put all our timetables wrong, and subjected the public to a large amount of inconvenience. In the meanwhile an army of navvies was drafted to the spot, and worked day and night to repair the damage. At this time I was driving 2 through trains each day, namely one from Mantua to Venice in the early morning, and a return train from Venice to Mantua in the afternoon. A tolerably full day's work, covering about 190 miles of ground, and occupying between 10 and 11 hours. I was therefore not best pleased when, on the 3rd or 4th day after the accident, I was informed that, in addition to my regular allowance of work, I should that evening be required to drive a special train to Venice. This special train, consisting of an engine, a single carriage, and a brake van, was to leave the Mantua platform at 11. At Padua the passengers were to alight and find post-chaises waiting to convey them to Ponte di Brenta. At Ponte di Brenta another engine, carriage, and brake van were to be in readiness. I was charged to accompany them throughout. "Corpo di Bacco," said the clerk who gave me my orders. "You need not look so black, man. You are certain of a handsome gratuity. Do you know who goes with you?" "Not I." "Not you, indeed. Why, it's the Duca Loredano, the Neapolitan ambassador." "Loredano?" I stammered. "What Loredano? There was a Marchese—" "Certo. He was the Marchese Loredano some years ago, but he has come into his dukedom since then." "He must be a very old man by this time." "Yes, he is old. But what of that? He is as hale and bright and stately as ever. You have seen him before?" "Yes," I said, turning away. "I have seen him, years ago." "You have heard of his marriage?" I shook my head. The clerk chuckled, rubbed his hands, and shrugged his shoulders. "An extraordinary affair," he said. "Made a tremendous esclandre at the time. He married his mistress, quite a common, vulgar girl, a Genoese, very handsome, but not received, of course. Nobody visits her." "Married her!" I exclaimed. "Impossible!" "True, I assure you." I put my hand to my head. I felt as if I had had a fall or a blow. Does she go to-night?" I faltered. "Oh, dear, yes. Goes everywhere with him. Never lets him out of her sight. You'll see her, la bella duchessa." With this my informant laughed and rubbed his hands again and went back to his office. The day went by, I scarcely know how, except that my whole soul was in a tumult of rage and bitterness. I returned from my afternoon's work about 7:25, and at 10:30 I was once again at the station. I had examined the engine, given instructions to the facchista, or stoker, about the fire, seen to the supply of oil, and got all in readiness when, just as I was about to compare my watch with the clock in the ticket office, a hand was laid upon my arm, and a voice in my ear said, "Are you the engine driver who is going on with this special train?" I had never seen the speaker before. He was a small, dark man, muffled up about the throat, with blue glasses, a large black beard, and his hat drawn low upon his eyes. "You are a poor man, I suppose," he said, in a quick, eager whisper, "and like other poor men would not object to be better off. Would you like to earn a couple of 1,000 florins?" "In what way?" "Hush! You are to stop at Padua, are you not? And to go on again to Ponte di Brenta?" I nodded. "Suppose you did nothing of the kind. Suppose, instead of turning off the steam, you jump off the engine, and let the train run on." "Impossible. There are 70 yards of embankment gone, and—" "Basta! I know that. Save yourself, and let the train run on. It would be nothing but an accident." I turned hot and cold. I trembled. My heart beat fast, and my breath failed. "Why do you tempt me?" I faltered. "For Italy's sake," he whispered. "For liberty's sake. I know you are no Italian, but for all that you may be a friend. This Loredano is one of his country's bitterest enemies. Stay. Here are the 2,000 florins." I thrust his hand back fiercely. "No, no," I said. "No blood money. If I do it neither for Italy nor for money, but for vengeance." "For vengeance," he repeated. At this moment the signal was given for backing up to the platform. I sprang to my place upon the engine without another word. When I again looked toward the spot where he had been standing, the stranger was gone. I saw them take their places, Duke and Duchess, secretary and priest, valet and maid. I saw the station-master bow them into the carriage, and stand, bareheaded, beside the door. I could not distinguish their faces. The platform was too dusk, and the glare from the engine fire too strong. But I recognized her stately figure, and the poise of her head. Had I not been told who she was, I should have known her by those traits alone. Then the guard's whistle shrilled out, and the station-master made his last bow. I turned the steam on, and we started. My blood was on fire. I no longer trembled or hesitated. I felt as if every nerve was iron, and every pulse instinct with deadly purpose. She was in my power, and I would be avenged. She should die. She, for whom I had stained my soul with my friend's blood. She should die in the plenitude of her wealth and her beauty, and no power upon earth should save her. The stations flew past. I put on more steam. I bade the fireman heap in the coke, and stir the blazing mass. I would have outstripped the wind, had it been possible. Faster and faster, hedges and trees, bridges and stations flashing past, villages no sooner seen than gone, telegraph wires twisting and dipping and twining themselves in one with the awful swiftness of our pace. Faster and faster, till the fireman at my side looks white and scared, and refuses to add more fuel to the furnace. Faster and faster, till the wind rushes in our faces and drives the breath back upon our lips. I would have scorned to save myself. I meant to die with the rest, mad as I was, and I believe from my very soul that I was utterly mad for the time. I felt a passing pang of pity for the old man and his suite. I would have spared the poor fellow at my side too, if I could, but the pace at which we were going made escape impossible. Vicenza was past, a mere confused vision of lights. Pajana flew by. At Padua, but 9 miles distant, our passengers were to alight. I saw the fireman's face turned upon me in remonstrance. I saw his lips move, though I could not hear a word. I saw his expression change suddenly from remonstrance to a deadly terror, and then, merciful heaven, then for the first time I saw that he and I were no longer alone upon the engine. There was a third man standing on my right hand, as the fireman was standing on my left, a tall, stalwart man with short curling hair and a flat Scotch cap upon his head. As I fell back in the first shock of surprise, he stepped nearer, took my place at the engine, and turned the steam off. I opened my lips to speak to him. He turned his head slowly and looked me in the face. Matthew Price. I uttered one long, wild cry, flung my arms wildly up above my head, and fell as if I had been smitten with an axe. I am prepared for the objections that may be made to my story. I expect, as a matter of course, to be told that this was an optical illusion, or that I was suffering from pressure on the brain, or even that I labored under an attack of temporary insanity. I have heard all these arguments before, and, if I may be forgiven for saying so, I have no desire to hear them again. My own mind has been made up upon this subject for many a year. All I can say, all that I know is, that Matthew Price came back from the dead to save my soul and the lives of those whom I, in my guilty rage, would have hurried to destruction. I believe this as I believe in the mercy of heaven and the forgiveness of repentant sinners. End of Number 5 Branchline, The Engineer.